UN mandate. But I take note of the fact that the current UN Security Resolution 1970 does not authorize the use of armed forces.
There's agreement from NATO the killing has to stop, but concerns that have to be addressed before everyone signs up to military action. Member states are looking for three things. Evidence action is needed, a clear legal go-ahead for military operations, and political support from the African Union and the Arab League.
I will not embark on definitions, whether it's a civil war or not. What we can see is that it is an armed upheaval. There is fighting. There is, of course, also the risk of division within the country, and the risk of seeing a failed state in the future that could be the breeding ground for extremism and terrorism.
NATO is best placed to carry out any operation which would cripple Muammar Gaddafi's air defences and air force. But the politicians at this stage are more concerned about political cover rather than air cover. They want widespread international agreement on any future action so that this cannot be painted as Western military aggression against an Arab nation. Many countries around the table believe there should be a no-fly zone, but want a UN green light before anything happens.
It is necessary to have the mandate from the Security Council, and without that mandate, the Euro-Atlantic community will not do anything, shouldn't do anything.
NATO insists more planning is needed if a no-fly zone is required. But what must come first? The political will from the entire international community before any military action targets Libya and Libyans. The NATO Secretary-General said it was inconceivable that the international community would stand idly by while the killing continued in Libya. What NATO has now done is said to the United Nations, if something is to be done about this quickly, you have to make the decision, you have to give the go-ahead. They say that it could take 2 to 3 days for a no-fly zone to be set up around Libya. But first, the politicians have to give the go-ahead.
Well, Britain and France have issued a joint statement saying Gaddafi must go and that the EU should prepare to support the Libyan rebellion. France had earlier recognised the Benghazi-based opposition council as Libya's rightful government. Tim Friend has more from Paris.
After being accused of being slow to react to the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, the French president has moved quickly to silence his critics and take the lead in reprisals against Colonel Gaddafi. Meeting representatives of the rebels at the Elysee Palace, he promised them immediate diplomatic recognition.
France has expressed its satisfaction about the creation of the Libyan National Transition Council. And after this meeting with President Sarkozy, I can say that France has recognized the Transitional National Council as the legitimate representation of the Libyan people.
The French plan is reported to include proposing limited airstrikes against key Gaddafi targets, such as his headquarters and a military airbase. There was no official confirmation from President Sarkozy's office, and it's a highly controversial proposal that would meet with strong resistance from many European allies, who are also wary of giving the rebel representatives diplomatic recognition at this stage.
That's a decision by a single government. I think it's better for us to listen to the stance of the entire European community.
The Elysee Palace says that Mr. Sarkozy is seeking legal authority to prevent the use of force by Gaddafi. It believes that jamming his communications would be a good start. Tim Friend, Al Jazeera, Paris.
Well, at a meeting of the Gulf Cooperation Council in Saudi Arabia, Arab nations joined international condemnation of the Gaddafi government. Qatar's Prime Minister says the GCC supports a no-fly zone and wants to establish ties with the Libyan opposition.
When it comes to Libya, I think the regime has lost its legitimacy. We support the no-fly zone. We also support contact with the National Council in Libya. It is time to discuss the situation with them, and the Security Council should shoulder its responsibility. It is important to impose the no-fly zone. The GCC already announced this, but I think there should be international support.
The US president's top intelligence chief says the longer the conflict in Libya drags on, the more likely it is that Muammar Gaddafi's forces will prevail. For more on that, let's cross over now to Daljit Dhaliwal in our Washington Broadcast Centre. Daljit.
Laura, thanks very much. Well, James Clapper, who's the Director of National Intelligence, says the US must consider the possibility of a Gaddafi victory or even a stalemate that could split Libya apart. But his assessment was quickly disputed by the National Security Advisor. Patty Culhane has more.
If the rebels in Libya were looking for reassurance as they fight for their lives and freedom, they got the exact opposite from Washington, as the man in charge of all U.S. intelligence agencies forecasted their eventual defeat and a Gaddafi victory.
I think over the longer term that the regime will prevail. Right.
James Clapper told Congress because Colonel Muammar Gaddafi's forces have superior weapons and logistical capabilities, at best, rebels could hope for a stalemate, an outcome the U.S. doesn't want to see. But officials have also made it clear that the U.S. won't be the only country taking steps to prevent that.
The United States acting alone would be stepping into a situation whose consequences are unforeseeable. And I know that's the way our military feels. It's easy for people to say, do this, do that, and then they turn and say, okay, U.S., go do it.
Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, for the first time, downplaying the potential effectiveness of a no-fly zone, saying it failed to stop the violence in Iraq or Kosovo. The U.S. instead is focusing on diplomatic moves, cutting ties with the Libyan embassy, and Clinton is planning to meet with Libyan opposition leaders next week.
We are still engaged in the process of assessing those groups, the council, and other individuals to find out what their vision is, who they represent, what their ideas are, and where they would take Libya in a post-Gaddafi future.
The Obama administration trying to take back the comments from its very own Director of National Intelligence, the National Security Advisor, telling reporters that Director Clapper was making a static assessment, simply looking at the number of tanks and the kinds of weapons. But if you include things like Gaddafi's isolation or the motivation of the rebels, well, you could come up with a much different assessment. Now, the administration has been very carefully trying to get to Gaddafi's inner circle, to send the message that they will lose. You have to wonder if they're still happy with their Director of National Intelligence after he sent the message to the world that they'll likely win. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, Hillary Clinton says that she is also going to the region next week. Now, this is the highest level visit by a U.S. official to the Middle East since the popular uprisings began. The U.S. Secretary of State will go to Egypt and Tunisia as both form new governments. The administration says that she'll discuss a range of economic reforms which the U.S. hopes can form the basis for broader political stability. Clinton is also expected to press for democratic reforms and articulate the U.S. government's position on universal values. Well, for more on the trip, I'm joined from Boston by Graham Wood, who's a contributing editor at the